At Athlete Assessments, you know that we focus on understanding yourself as being the pillar or the foundation towards athletic success or coaching success. When we're talking about understanding yourself, one of the vital components of this is how we apply that knowledge of ourselves to acquiring skill. Now, skill acquisition here in Australia is a topic which is, very successfully covered by some researchers and professors in this particular area. There is a lot of professional teams that employ the services of skill acquisition specialists. We're looking specifically at the most effective way to develop a technique into a consistent technique so that it becomes a skill under pressure. And that's the challenge for every single athlete. I was recently attending a conference and this topic came up, and I started linking it back to the type of work that we do. Because when we talk about skill acquisition, what we're relating it to is an athlete's ability to what we call self-regulate. Now, self-regulation is inherently linked to an athlete's level of self-awareness. How well do you understand your strengths, your limitations, your motives, how you actually prepare and put yourself in a position where you can execute your skill in pressure. So self-regulation from a skill acquisition perspective relies on 4 components. And the first one of these components is what we call self-planning. And so what's been found is that athletes that have the ability to self-regulate invariably achieve better results than those that don't. So the first step being self-planning. So that looks like an athlete that turns up to practice with a plan in place in terms of their goals that they'd like to achieve for that practice, what they'd like to do better, perhaps even looking at some footage of themselves performing in the past and looking at the key areas they have in their own mind as to what they want to improve on for this session. Now, it's athlete driven. The whole concept of self-regulation is it's done by self. Instead of what often is the conversation is a coach telling the athlete that today you're going to improve in this and this and this. These are your goals for today. Self-regulation means that we take accountability for doing that ourselves. The next step is from self-planning, it goes into self-monitoring. And so once we've got a plan in place, we need to monitor our progress towards achieving that particular plan. And that's as we go through the practice session, literally taking stock of what am I doing, am I executing what I said I was going to execute, getting feedback from others. The next step from self-monitoring is self-evaluation. Now, self-evaluation happens after perhaps a technical drill that you've executed, and particularly after a practice session where you stop, you think back on what you've just done, and you literally evaluate your progress. So you may be looking at the goals that you were looking at achieving in that self-planning stage, and then evaluating, maybe even giving yourself. I encourage athletes to give themselves a ranking out of 10. If you said you wanted to improve in this particular area of your technique, it's the end of the session now, where are you at? Do you feel like you've made progress there? So that's the self-evaluation. The final component of the self-regulation process is what we call self-reflection. And that's in those quieter moments where we reflect back on the performances of the week, looking at what we did well, looking at what we need to improve upon, because it's that self-reflection piece that then takes us back into the cycle of the next stage of planning. And so that on a weekly basis, those athletes that become the more successful athletes are the ones that continually cycle through this process. I remember myself as an athlete when I was younger. I didn't realize that I was doing it at the time, but I was one of those athletes that liked to keep a training journal. I keep track of what my heart rate was in the morning, what my body weight was, what the training session was, and I keep track of the technical points that my coach would talk to me about in terms of the areas that I needed to improve. Now, what that turned into was planning for the next session. And as I said to you before, I didn't realize that I was doing this. It's only in hindsight when I reflect upon how did I make the Olympic team when I was 18 and how did I have a relatively successful career that I can attribute to some of these key factors. Because when the coach would tell me to work on these key areas, I would then look at the next session and I'd start writing a plan for myself on how I was going to develop in these areas. And so for me, that was a skill which helped me get the most out of myself. So self-regulation, you can help your athletes do it by starting the process for them, giving them training diaries, helping them set plans for themselves to improve, even having them take some ownership and involvement in what the actual drills are that you may utilize in any given practice session, which is going to specifically help them to improve in these areas. The end result is not simply better performance, but it's an athlete who is highly engaged in their own learning. And when an athlete is really engaged in their learning, the results follow from that, and it can only possibly be positive.